Hello everybody and welcome to another video. Today we're actually going to do something a little different and something that I don't believe I've actually done before, and that is an album rank for the band Insomnium. So in case some of you might not know, which I'm sure at least some of you probably do, Insomnium is one of my favorite bands. They're in like my top 3, I would say. Maybe after Red, they might be like my second favorite band. It depends on the day, but I really enjoy all of their albums, and I think all of their albums are really good, so I figured why not do a video kind of talking about each of them and ranking them from my favorite to my least favorite and stuff like that. So I suppose we'll get right started into it. At the bottom, at my least favorite, keep in mind, just because it's my least favorite doesn't mean I dislike it. I think all of their albums are really good, and I said that already. So my least favorite is their debut album, In the Halls of Awaiting. Like I said, this is still a very good album, and it's a very good debut for Insomnium, but I feel like it is just kind of, in some ways, a kind of typical melodic death metal album. Not really. You can see some of like Insomnium's signature elements shine through every now and then, but really, I think in general it is a little bit more of a traditional, normal melodic death metal album than, you know, something that Insomnium does, where they just kind of have their own style and everything. And of course that kind of makes sense. This was their first album, and they were just getting into doing music and everything, or maybe not just getting into doing music, but they were just getting really started as a band at this point, because it is their debut. On one hand, I can completely understand that, but it is still, I think, the songwriting on this album, I think, is the weakest out of all of their albums, and, you know, things like that just make sense because it's their first album. So, I will say there are a few songs on here that I do actually enjoy quite a lot, like Dying, Chant, and I also like The Bitter End, as well as the title track, In the Halls of Awaiting. Next up, my second to least favorite is, of course, their second album, Since the Day It All Came Down, and no, this is not just going to be in order of their album's release. So, Since the Day It All Came Down is pretty much, I think, everything that you would want a second album from a band to be, much in the same way that you would want like a second movie or a second video game or book or whatever you put in there. It keeps all of the elements of what you liked about the first one and expands upon it and builds upon it and makes it better. This album, I think, in just about every way, is better than their debut, and it has several good songs on this one as well, like the title track-ish. It's not 100%, but it's almost there, which is The Day It All Came Down, and I also like Under the Plaintive Sky, and a couple others as well. And generally, the things that I said about their debut, I could also say about this album. It is not quite as much of a typical melodic death metal album. In this one, you can see a little bit more of Insomnium's style come through, since they at this point had grown a little bit as musicians and whatnot. It is still one of their weakest from a songwriting standpoint in general, even though I think The Day It All Came Down is one of their strongest songs. But generally, it is still one of their weaker albums, I think. Then I believe at what would be number 5 is Across the Dark. And this is their 4th album, and I've seen a lot of people say this is their favorite album, and I can, to an extent, see why. There is a lot of good stuff here, and to me this is kind of a transition album in a way, because, at least to me, I don't know if anyone else feels this way, but Insomnium's first 3 albums are kind of the classic Insomnium sound, which would be In the Halls of Awaiting, Since the Day It All Came Down, and Above the Weeping World. Those are all kind of stylistically similar, and then their last few albums, One for Sorrow, Shadows of the Dying Sun, and Winter's Gate, also are a little more stylistically similar, but a little different from their first 3 albums, and that, I think, is where they kind of really solidified what their sound is going to be. And this album, to me, Across the Dark, is kind of the transition between that, because it has a lot of elements of the classic Insomnium as well as the modern Insomnium. I think that is one of its biggest strengths, because it has kind of the best of both worlds, I guess. And not saying that their first 3 albums didn't have elements of their newer stuff, or their newer stuff doesn't have elements of their older stuff, but to me this album is just like the perfect mix of both, and I can definitely appreciate it for that. And there are several good songs on this one as well, like Down with the Sun, Where the Last Wave Broke, and The New Beginning. Those are just a couple of my favorites. The rest of them are still pretty good, but again, I do think that this is not as good as some of their other material. Next up, I've got their 5th album in 4th place, which is One for Sorrow. And this album I actually do think is kind of underrated, because usually when you hear people talk about Insomnium's best albums, they always mention like Above the Weeping World, Shadows of the Dying Sun, or Winter's Gate, and granted, of course, you can probably tell those 3 albums haven't been mentioned yet, so I do believe all 3 of those are better than this album. However, I do think that One for Sorrow is still kind of underrated. It's a really, really great album, and I enjoy it a lot. It also has possibly my favorite intro track that Insomnium has done, because usually they start out their albums with like a shorter, not always shorter, but just a little intro song. So like on Above the Weeping World they have The Gale, and on Shadows of the Dying Sun they have The Primeval Dark. Those are just a couple examples. This album has Inertia, which is, even though it's only the intro song, is one of my favorites from the album. Other ones like Song of the Blackest Bird, Only One Who Waits, and the title track are all really great songs, and I think the title track is one of Insomnium's strongest songs to date. I really love that song. And even though I don't necessarily think this is Insomnium's best album, I think it has every element that it needs and every element of a good Insomnium album. It doesn't necessarily do everything as good as some of their others, but it has all of the good elements that Insomnium brings to the table in it, and it has all of the elements of a good album and a good Insomnium album. Now, number 3 and number 2 usually for me are pretty interchangeable. If you ask me like which one I prefer, some days it'll be one, some days it'll be the other. So just keep that in mind. Number 2 and number 3 are like pretty much in the same one, but I had to come up with some sort of order. So at number 3 I have Above the Weeping World. This album has a lot of Insomnium's best songs on it, I think. Like I said, The Gale is a really great opener, then it has Mortal Share, Change of Heart, The Killjoy, and Devoid of Caring, which are all, I think, some of Insomnium's best songs. It's just really good throughout the album. However, I do think there's a couple songs that I don't really care for quite as much, and I don't enjoy this album quite as consistently as what I had for number 2. Which is the main reason this is lower. It is a really great album, and a lot of people say this is their best one, and even though I personally don't think that, I can definitely see why, because it is definitely a fantastic album. At number 2, I have Shadows of the Dying Sun. Like I said, this one and Above the Weeping World are pretty much interchangeable, but I just usually enjoy this one more consistently if I listen to it beginning to end. I enjoy it more consistently than I enjoy Above the Weeping World, even though that is still a great album. I believe it's the first Insomnium album that I heard, which could potentially contribute to why it's so high, but I think it is just a really, really great album, and one of my favorite albums ever. It starts off really strong, and it ends really strong. The 3 best songs on this album, in my opinion, are the first 3 songs, or at least tracks 2 and 3, which is Primeval Dark, While We Sleep, and Revelation. Revelation is probably my favorite song on this album. And Shadows of the Dying Sun, which is the closing track, is also really, really good. And I would probably say it's my second favorite closing track from an Insomnium album, with the first probably being One for Sorrow. But really everything else in between those is still really good. Black Heart Rebellion has a little bit of like a black metal element to it, which I thought was really cool. Blues Tonight is a little bit more of kind of a ballad in a way. The River and the Promethean song are really kind of longer songs, like 7 or 8 minutes long, I think. Kind of remind me a little bit of their album Winter's Gate, even though these ones are, of course, much shorter than that album. They kind of, to me, feel sort of similar. Collapsing Words is probably one of my least favorite songs on the album, but it is still really good, and I do actually really like the kind of lyrics and the meaning behind that song. Same thing goes for Ephemeral. Aside from it being one of my least favorites, that's also one of my favorites, actually. I really love the song Ephemeral. It's one of the shortest songs on the album, but it's really good, and I really love the lyrics and the message behind that song, and that's part of why it's one of my favorites. Plus, it's just one of the catchiest Insomnium songs, I think. But it's really, really good. And in general, I just think this is a really fantastic album, and one that I would probably say is nearly perfect. I enjoy every single song on here quite a lot, and it's just generally really good. And that, of course, brings us to number one, which is, if you've followed my channel or anything for a while, you probably knew what number one was going to be right off the bat, and that is Winter's Gate. So I have not been particularly secretive about this album being my favorite from Insomnium, and not only that, but it is probably my favorite song of all time, since it is one 40-minute long song, and it is also my favorite album of all time. It seems like I really don't get sick of listening to it. I mean, of course, if I listen to it a whole lot, and then, you know, I want to listen to something else, but every time I listen to it, I still enjoy it just as much as the last time, which is something that I can't really say for some other albums. Everything about it to me is just really, really great, from the lyrics to the overall sound and the way it kind of transitions from section to section, I guess, because even though this is one song, it's not written the same way that most songs are. And there are so many great moments throughout the album that I just really enjoy, and a lot of really great guitar riffs and all these different things that just come together to make it, to me, as close to a perfect album as you can get. And this is also one of the very few albums that, in general, that I can't really come up with any negatives for. I think pretty much everything about the album is absolutely fantastic. Granted, there are some other albums that I think have very, very few or occasionally no flaws that I can think of, but this one just does everything a little bit better than those albums do, even though I might not think that they necessarily have flaws, or as many flaws as some other albums. So that's pretty much the end of the list. Winter's Gate is my favorite album by these guys. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this video. Do you agree with any of my picks, and how would you rank Insomnium's discography? Let me know down in the comments. I believe at this point I've only reviewed Winter's Gate, so if you guys want to see me review any of their other albums, leave those in the comments as well. And that pretty much wraps up the video, so I will see you all next time.